episode of Spark Talk. Today we're talking about a really important question, and that is the announcement by the Communist Party of Cuba to roll out a series of economic reforms, which, if implemented, will spell the death of the Cuban Revolution. Now, this is a really, really controversial question at the moment, and it is dividing opinions amongst the left in quite a sharp way. There are those who support these reforms, calling them the start of Cuba's China and Vietnam moment, arguing that these will finally be the road to progress and the way to save the Cuban Revolution. And then there are those like us who warn that this is a huge betrayal and must be opposed. Ultimately, the reality on the ground is one where Cuba is seriously being choked to death by the US and real people are struggling. So the situation is not an easy one. So what exactly are revolutionaries to do in this situation? To discuss this, I'm joined once again by Comrade John Masters. Hi, John.
Hi, Mansa. How are you?
Well, thank you. How are you?
Not too bad.
Good. Okay, so let's get right into it. I think I want to probably spend the bulk of our discussion really going into what the tasks of revolutionaries ought to be in a moment like this, because, you know, it's a moment where counter-revolution, if we do nothing, could be imminent, and we've got, you know, historical examples to draw upon. But I think before we do any of that, let's just spell out for our listeners what exactly is going on. What are these reforms? Why did the Cuban Communist Party accept them? And so on.
Okay, I'll try to do that in a brief way, because I agree that the key purpose should be to deal with the way forward, including the different alternatives presented on the left. Okay, as you indicated at the beginning, Cuba's in an absolutely dire situation. I think the last podcast I did with you on this subject was maybe a month ago. The siege by U.S. imperialism right now has made things even worse. The economy's totally collapsed. Blackouts now last on average 30 to 40 consecutive hours. Food and medicine's almost impossible to get outside of the black market or private stores that have grossly inflated prices. There's a steady drumbeat of military threats, and U.S. sanctions have even led almost all the foreign investors in the tourism and nickel industries in Cuba just to pull out. Meanwhile, you're getting pot-banging protests in Havana and other cities almost every night. So the situation is really dire, and everyone knows it can't last. However, the latest blow to the revolution hasn't come directly from Washington, but as you indicated, it's come from the leadership of the Cuban Communist Party. A few days ago, it announced a series of economic reforms that would be utterly disastrous and would, in fact, if implemented, open the door very wide to the complete destruction of the worker state. There are 147 of them. The presentation at the National Assembly meeting went on for 2 hours. I'm just going to mention what I think the three most important things are. First of all, they would dismantle what remains of the planned economy. Secondly, they would allow almost unlimited private ownership and imperialist economic penetration of the island. And third, they would completely eliminate programs like the ration book that provided a bit of a minimum of basic necessities for the population. So that's the core of I think, what's gone on and set the stage for the party's decision.
Yeah, I mean, they're quite serious, these measures. Now, from my surveying of the different arguments and articles by different elements on the left, as I said at the start, it's quite split, the opinions. There are some things I find interesting on this. One thing is that there is a lot of animosity against those who criticize these reforms by supporters of the Cuban government, by other sort of like anti-imperialist elements who say that, well, if you oppose these, you are just, you're just like, you live in the pure realm of theory and you're just Western, you're not actually in touch with the difficulties on the ground, and the government is doing everything they can to survive this situation. And I mean, the moral stuff aside about the Western left being corrupt and all that, there is a grain of truth there is a lot of truth to the fact that it's a really, really difficult situation. But then they use that situation to then excuse the government's course of accepting these reforms. So that's one side. I think then the other is the in my reading anyways, I'm sure you would be able to say more on this, but the more like Trotskyist left. So I include ourselves in this, obviously, but then there's, I think, groups like the RCI, the Revolution Communist International, who's also written articles saying that this does open the door to capitalist restoration. I think Left Voice in the United States has said something similar. So there is opposition as well. Now, there's those two sort of polarizations. I'm not sure what else is there in terms of the landscape right now.
Well,
the left.
I think you broadly laid out the two poles, and maybe as we go through this discussion, we can deal with that in a little bit more detail. I guess first, basic principles on this. Look, as Trotskyists, we've always defended Cuba's revolution, which was the first to overthrow capitalism in the Western Hemisphere, and thus is a immense victory for workers in the world. However, while we've done this unconditionally, irrespective of the particular policies pursued by the Communist Party leaders, we've regularly warned that many of these policies were leading toward disaster. I don't, in this podcast, want to go into the past ones, but the point is now this is coming to a head. The defenders of the Cuban Revolution have to start by opposing these measures. They're not some way to somehow strengthen socialism, as PCC, that's Cuban Communist Party leader Diaz-Canel, said in his speech motivating them in the National Assembly, but they're directly paving the way toward counter-revolution. So I think what we need to talk about in the context of dealing with the different responses on the left is first, why this disastrous course has to be opposed, and second, how to do it. And on the latter, the punchlines I would do, although I think we can elaborate them later. Right now, I'll pose it abstractly. The alternative is revolutionary internationalism, radical egalitarianism, and mass mobilization based on the fullest workers' democracy. That's abstract. I'll try to explain what I mean as we go through this discussion. If you like, I can deal with some of the arguments raised both by the Diaz-Canel leadership and its apologists abroad for why this was necessary, and then try to refute them briefly. Maybe I can do that first.
Yeah, I think
Sure.
that's necessary because that's the bulk of the arguments I've seen online.
Yeah, maybe I should just make clear first that there are a few groups that have a significantly better position, which I don't think in this podcast I want to go through in any detail. But for example, after we issued our statement, there were reasonably good statements by both the Permanent Revolution Current, which is centered on the Argentine PST, I believe they're called, and Left Voice in the U.S., and also the Revolutionary Communist International. There's also one that your listeners may not be as familiar with. It's a group originating in Cuba called Communist Cuba, and they all issued statements opposing sharply these reforms, arguing they were going to lead back to capitalism. I would argue the main weakness of all of them, less so Communist Cuba, which was a bit better on this score, is they don't attempt to outline a concrete course of struggle. It's especially so for the RCI, which after a very good analysis just falls back into abstractions about world revolution and building their own party. Nonetheless, we broadly solidarize with these statements and believe groups with these views should find ways to work together to help forge the necessary new revolutionary leadership in Cuba. So that's kind of what I have to say about them. I don't think that's the main thing we need to go through in this discussion.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think just to add my 2 cents to that, like there is a certain line right now on this question, which is you have to be against the course of the government, right? So we can put our other differences with other various groups aside to the extent that they're actually taking the right course of action when it comes to Cuba at the moment. So yes, I think it's necessary to find opportunities and ways of working together with those groups to push that in a united front manner, because it's a life and death question right now for Cuba. Strongly agree with that. Yeah. Okay.
So to turn then to the arguments of the regime, the Cuban government and its apologists abroad. First of all, this argument that is made that it's necessary to continue socialist construction is just absolutely false. You can see headlines in bourgeois newspapers around the world saying Cuba turning toward capitalism. I'm afraid these are vastly more accurate headlines than what you're going to see in Granma or other newspapers of the Cuban Communist Party. Yes, we're fully aware Cuba has a gun to its head, but rather than finding a way to resist in the interests of the workers, the PCC leaders are really surrendering to imperialism. And even with all these measures that they propose to adopt, which would be disastrous, none of this is going to be enough for the U.S. imperialists. It's only going to further embolden them to ensure that one way or another the PCC is driven from power, whether that comes through military intervention or fomenting an anti-communist revolt or the so-called Venezuela method of finding some pliant elements within the regime, and we don't know. Now, the other argument we hear from Communist Party leaders and those who support them is that Cuba's implementing the so-called model used in China and Vietnam, which, speaking broadly, meant the introduction of market mechanisms and imperialist investment under ultimate state control. Let me just say, this is not what's happening. The measures Diaz-Canel are pushing are not those. They're actually exactly what's being dictated to them by the U.S. rulers in various negotiations that are being held. In fact, as over the 5 months since the real offensive began against Cuba, the PCC leaders have relied on negotiations, and this has been a total disaster. All it's done is led to ever more escalation by Trump and Rubio. And the latest concessions, not concessions, betrayals, are not going to buy more time for the revolution, but can only actually accelerate its destruction. The other reason the China-Vietnam analogy is it's false on so many levels, but let me deal with a few. First of all, China and Vietnam implemented their market reforms during the period of U.S.-sponsored globalization. That is the time when Washington was pushing policies of free trade and open markets as the best means to maintain its global hegemony. That's completely finished. Instead, you've got the brute violence of Trump as he tries to restore U.S. imperialism's hegemony.
Consciously reversing globalization.
Exactly. So it just cannot, what China and Vietnam did just cannot happen in Cuba. Second, Marxists have to recognize that far from being, benign measures, the market reforms in China and Vietnam also produced vast increases in inequality. China has a large capitalist class that, while it doesn't currently hold state power, is a major threat to the worker state. We've discussed this much more elsewhere. I'm not going to go into that in detail here. But in the case of Vietnam, their Stalinist rulers have now gone so far as to ally with the U.S. against China. They even joined Trump's, what does he call it, Board of Peace. And the third reason why this analogy is completely false is Cuba has nowhere near the position in the world of China or even Vietnam, nowhere near the population levels or the natural resources, nor is it thousands and thousands of kilometers away in East Asia, but it's right next door, 90 miles from the U.S. Colossus. And the U.S. imperialists would never in the past and will never now allow China to take the so-called take the China road, if you will. Their program has always been communists out and capitalists in. So just to conclude this part of the argument, the real parallel, if you want to go back historically to what the Cuban leadership is doing now, isn't China or Vietnam. It's the Soviet Union starting in the late 1980s. Under Mikhail Gorbachev, there were widespread concessions to imperialism that directly paved the way for the destruction of the world's first worker state, the Soviet Union, which was a massive disaster for workers everywhere. And ultimately, the Soviet bureaucracy fractured, and a wing led by Boris Yeltsin openly allied with U.S. imperialism to lead a counter-revolution. And through this period, through their lies, their corruption, their economic mismanagement, the Soviet rulers drove huge layers of the population to the right, which massively aided this counter-revolutionary drive. And I think there's direct parallels to Cuba today, the situation on the ground and the threat hanging over it.
Yeah. I wanted to touch on that a little bit in terms of, because the situation is so desperate. You mentioned at the start that there's daily protests, like pot banging protests. Like, are they? I think we discussed this in our last conversation on the question as well. But it's hard. Are they against the U.S.? Are they against the government? Like, I think things have gotten so bad that there's probably a real fertile ground for like counter-revolutionary sentiments to take hold.
I would agree with that. Let me just say right away, we don't know. We're not on the ground
Yeah.
in Cuba. We can't assess the exact character of these protests. I'll tell you my impression. That the fundamental thing deriving them is just economic despair. No food, no fuel, blackouts going on endlessly. And all you get from the government is empty rhetoric and talk about how this is socialism. And certainly there's fertile ground among this for elements sympathetic to U.S. imperialism to move in and try to manipulate the protests. So we did see one, I think it was like a couple of months ago now, in a town in central Cuba called Moron, where the protesters actually sacked the offices of the Communist Party.
Yes. Right.
However, I think the only way the Cuban government is responding to this is with putting down the protests and repression. We saw this in a bigger way when there were major waves of protests starting in 2021, again in 2023 and 2024, when there were mass arrests, and these mixed together arrests of counter-revolutionary elements with people who were just out there protesting, wanting a different way forward. So while we can't have a feel for the full detail of each and every protest, the fundamental point is that the economic despair combined with a complete absence of what we would call workers' democracy, a question I'll go into a little bit later, means that the current leaders of the Communist Party cannot address this in a way that points a way forward for the working people.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Now, you use this phrase that Cuba's got a gun to its head.
Yes.
And I think that's a very apt phrase in this context. And that's precisely one of the things that the apologists for the Cuban government use, that you're criticizing, based on the comfort of your imperialist countries far away, and you have no idea how difficult things are, la 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 la, whatever. But I think the difficulty in terms of, okay, fine, we oppose these reforms, good. I think it's, what do we do with that opposition? Because there's a number of objective difficulties, and I think this is where I'd like to start to take the discussion next. I mean, if you look broadly in Latin America, since the last time we spoke, we have two new right-wing governments in Colombia and Peru. The tide for like a quote anti-imperialist wave, which would be really the thing that could beat back the U.S., could pose a real threat to the U.S. That's those chances are, I don't know, not looking good. Then Cuba is, of course, an island nation. Cuba is in a very desperate situation. So I see all these objective difficulties. So what are we to do beyond just saying, oppose this spells the death of the revolution, which is true, but how do we offer something to do?
Okay, so let me deal with this in two categories, international policy and also policies to safeguard the revolution within the island. They're obviously connected, but let me deal with them sequentially just for simplicity. First of all, internationally. The starting point has to be to end all conciliation of the imperialists and instead appeal to workers elsewhere to stand with Cuba. Now, there's this theme, there's been for a fair while. You see it sometimes if you read between the lines in Granma and then some of the statements by supporters of the Cuban government abroad. It's like hoping to wait out Trump. Maybe we'll get a more progressive administration in the U.S. in 2028. It's a total dead end. I think that's so evident now. There's no time, first of all. But more fundamentally, the Democrats, like the Republicans, are proven enemies of the revolution. They've enforced the blockades, sanctions for decades. And the allies that must be looked to are workers in the U.S., including Black and Latino workers who are ground down by capitalist attacks. Yes, that's not easy. It requires a struggle, but that's in the belly of the beast, the way forward. And if you look more broadly at Latin America, you rightly pointed out how the pink tide is almost totally receded now.
Mhm.
There's great difficulties, but let me make a point that Washington's oil blockade has only been effective because it's been enforced by the so-called remaining progressive governments in Latin America, particularly
Yeah, that's a
Mexico.
very fair point.
Yeah, particularly Mexico and Brazil. Colombia was as well. They've now got a
Mhm.
right-wing government, but Mexico and Brazil have oil. Mexico used to be the biggest supplier of oil after Venezuela to Cuba. I did see in my news feed this morning that the Sheinbaum government is now saying they might restart oil shipments to Cuba via private companies. We'll see. But the fact is the government there stopped all shipments at Washington's behest back in January. So,
yeah, exactly. And might win. Like, there's no time to lose.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
I think the point regarding how you pose this within Cuba is rather than the Communist Party leadership's constant praise for such governments, for Mexico, for Brazil, earlier for Colombia, earlier still for Venezuela, what we must demand is that they break the U.S. blockade, resume immediately, and massively increase fuel shipments to Cuba. And that means also calling on working people in these countries to take actions as needed, independent of and against our own rulers. And the point is, it's not a moral thing. It's, we're going to be good to Cuba. It's also in the direct interests of workers in these countries because it would drive forward the struggle against imperialism throughout Latin America. The third point I'd make is about international issues is China. Again, we've elaborated this in more detail in writing, but let me make a brief version of our point here. What's necessary is a struggle to call on the Chinese Communist Party to stop its own conciliation of imperialism and provide massive aid and personnel to rebuild Cuban infrastructure. They've got the ability to do this. They do this all the time within their own country, sometimes as part of the Belt Road Initiative elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to also call on the Chinese working class, which has more social power than any working class in the entire world, to take action to this end for Cuba. Shipments of rice, other humanitarian aid, fine, but it's nowhere near enough. And to reverse the point, if Cuba showed it was ready to fight, if there was a leadership there calling to stand up despite all the difficulties against imperialism, not capitulate, this could really rally hundreds of millions of toilers, I think, in China and throughout the global South, and maybe even help to turn some of the tide in Latin America. So that's kind of the international dimension of I think what's needed. So
yeah. No, I think I appreciate you laying that out in those general ways. I particularly like the way you said, the U.S. can declare an oil blockade, but that blockade has to be implemented.
Yes.
So, and it's this fundamental point that we make about a permanent revolution and why you need to, revolutionaries need to fight to show how the governments, however left-wing they might be in nationally oppressed countries, how they remain tied through whatever ways to imperialist powers. And this is a very concrete example of it. Lula can say all kinds of good things, but then his concrete deeds are not actually one that they're not helping Cuba. They are undermining Cuba's existence as a deformed worker state. It's similar to Sheinbaum. And I think with Sheinbaum, I think a lot of the left has really excused it, saying, oh, well, she doesn't send oil anymore, but she's sending lots of food. Well, good. But, what do we really need?
Right. Exactly.
So, and yeah, with Cuba, I again, wholeheartedly agree. I just did a discussion with Ray yesterday on China's role in the war against Iran. And I think all of those points apply. But here with the added element that, China's big thing is a Belt and Road Initiative. Well, why not take that strategy, that model, apply it. Like, send, I don't know, millions of solar panels to Cuba, several 100,000 workers, and Cuba would be good. But what's stopping that?
Exactly.
It's that China doesn't want to upset the status quo. And that's what's desperately needed, ultimately, to halt the offensive of Trump.
Yes, strongly agree with that. There's many problems with the Belt Road Initiative, but you can see what could be done. And why aren't they doing it in Cuba? So those are the some of the main arguments we would have against on the international level against this course. Maybe I can turn to some of the more what should you do inside Cuba questions.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's where it gets most difficult.
Yes, it is more difficult. Yeah. Let me say, I can't remember if I mentioned this earlier. We put out a statement on, I believe, Saturday, an initial statement opposing the reforms, and the main operational call, if you like, beyond the analysis, was the need to forge a left opposition in Cuba against this course, against these reforms, to fight to reverse them and set a course that can really defend the revolution. And what I outlined in terms of international policies is part of that, but you also have to deal with what is, in some ways, the harder question. What do you do on the ground in Cuba? And I fully recognize this is difficult. Cuba is a small island, 90 miles from the U.S. It has very little social or economic weight in the world, weak in natural resources, and it's totally under the gun. And it has few allies internationally, and they're kind of shrinking by the day as you look around Latin America. So what do you do? Well, it's not easy, but the short answer is you have to look for what force can safeguard the revolution. To those people who are claiming that there's no solution other than what the PCC leadership is doing, that is to embrace the very policies that the U.S. has been demanding, we say no, we need a very different plan. So in terms of a course of action within the island, you have to start from an understanding of what's the situation there. Right now, much of the population is at best totally cynical toward the Communist Party leadership. I have to say, and understandably so. They have no fuel,
absolutely,
food, medicine, empty slogans in the leadership. How do we win them away from despair, anger, and, as we talked about a few minutes ago, in some cases, even deadly illusions in U.S. imperialism? And part of that is what economic policy can we implement right now to salvage the revolution? And I think it's one that has to be based on the opposite of marketization and surrendering to the imperialists, but based on radical egalitarianism and mobilizing the masses on the basis of the fullest workers' democracy. So to explain that a little, maybe I can give a historical analogy. And I know historical analogies are never exact, but I think
I think they help because it's like, well, this was possible elsewhere.
Yes. So I think the clearest example comes from the early Soviet worker state under Lenin. Those are usually the best examples. After the 1917 revolution, the country was besieged by imperialist armies, sanctions, blockades, you name it. All of it was going on. The economy, which had already been shattered by the First World War, was driven into a terrible crisis. So to survive in the middle of, I believe it was June or July of 1918, the Soviet leaders adopted policies that came to be known as war communism. Now, in practice, what that meant was nationalization of all industry, state control of foreign trade, food rationing to keep the population going, and more. And the aim was for the revolution to survive, even as the Bolsheviks fought to build parties in other countries that could, spread the revolution. Crucially, however, these measures were combined with the widest possible workers' democracy and mobilization of the masses. It wasn't like fiat from above. Key policies were debated out openly in councils of workers, peasants, and soldiers. I'll give a couple of examples. In fact, the first is slightly before war communism was introduced. The Soviet leaders faced an excruciating choice about whether to accept very onerous peace terms with Germany to end the war. And there were three different positions in the leadership. And rather than sort of hide it all. You know, they, the options were debated openly before the working masses. 2 years later, there was another debate about the so-called militarization of labor. Again, opened
Hmm.
up to the masses, not hidden behind closed doors and masked by empty sloganeering, as you can see kind of in Cuba today. Lenin's position for trade union autonomy prevailed. So war communism lasted till 1921, and it allowed the worker state to survive. And then to revive the still shattered economy, only then, after the revolution had survived the immediate threat, the Bolsheviks introduced a program known as the New Economic Policy, or NEP, which allowed for marketization, imperialist investment, under strict control by the worker state. And once more, it was debated out openly before being adopted. So I've tried
Hmm.
to look at some of the more sophisticated arguments to try to apologize for the uh, Cuban government's current course, try to ignore the
Hmm.
ones on social media fields that just try to insult us as, Trotskyites who are counter-revolutionary opponents of the Cuban Revolution, that
Right.
garbage. So one of the ones I found most sophisticated was actually an article in the Communist Party of USA's paper People's World,
Okay.
published yesterday, I think. It was titled Socialism Under Siege, Cuba Embarks on Emergency Reforms to Survive. And it actually cites the NEP, the New Economic
Hmm.
Policy of Lenin, as what it calls an apt historical parallel. But
Right.
there's a crucial difference, as even the Communist Party USA's article admitted, that the Soviets had already beaten back foreign military invasions and counter-revolution before launching their economic reforms. In sharp contrast, the Cuban Communist Party is introducing changes that go much further than the NEP, even at the same time that Cuba's in the midst of a brutal imperialist assault. I think the
Right.
point
So
here
the balance of forces.
is very, very different. So it's just
Right.
the analogy falls apart. Cuba's under such extreme pressure today that opening up the economy, welcoming foreign investors in an unlimited way, like including the Gusanos, will likely lead to a complete collapse in the short term. That's just the stark facts. A different historical analogy, all proportions guarded, would be the decision by the leaders of East Germany to open the Berlin Wall in late 1989, if it was believed. As events move ever faster in Cuba toward a total crisis, the obvious question that would be posed among the masses would be, why do we even need the Communist Party? If we're going to have capitalism anyway, why not get rid of these guys? So, put simply, the chances for survival of the worker state through a controlled market liberalization, even one more controlled than what the Cuban leaders are currently arguing for, in such a weak position under the current leadership, under such intense U.S. pressure, I believe they're almost zero. To
Hmm.
gain the trust of the population, for whom the main preoccupation is daily survival, communists would have to make clear that we're all in this together. No privileges, no corruption, no speculation, total equality as we fight to survive. Don't expand privatizations, which are already running a huge part of the Cuban economy. Renationalize under workers' control. Don't suppress dissident voices and protests. Welcome open debate. And crucially, mobilize all possible social resources to survive the siege. That's an outline of what's needed. Of course, it needs more fleshing out. It's difficult to do that in
Hmm.
detail from afar. And of course, it might
Hmm.
not win, but it's the only and best option, including to rally working people around the world to seriously mobilize in defense of the Cuban Revolution. I truly think that that's the only outline of a road forward.
Hmm. Yeah, wow, that's a lot in what you said. I appreciate that analogy, but I guess I have a number of points. I think the thing about workers' democracy, I think it's exactly as you said, which is the need to build trust, because that's how you're going to undercut the potential of counter-revolutionary sentiment from prevailing. You can at least say, like, look, here's the situation. Let's debate this openly in workers' councils and so on and so forth. I think that's honestly, like, I don't follow Cuban politics, but from what I've been reading in the last number of days, this is hardly a question that comes up at all, about workers' democracy, because Yeah, that's key, but it's not as if that's a real thing. I was wondering, like, what kind of industry does Cuba have to nationalize? But I'm not sure. But there's certainly those, privatized tourist sector. I don't know.
Well, again, here, I'm afraid we have to be kind of abstract from afar, at least at this stage. We have to look into this more. But give you an example. Right now, the tourist sector is totally collapsed. I mean, the hotels are all empty. The foreign investors who had joint ventures with Cuba that, which did assist a bit economically in the past, they've all left under U.S. pressure. Uh, the one other significant industry in terms of things needed on a world basis, the nickel mines in the far east of Cuba, similarly, it's all shut down as in this case, Canadian foreign investor has pulled out. I'm not saying it's easy to restart these things if you have no money on the island, but that should be the perspective of finding a way to do that.
Yeah.
And also make the point, there's a huge housing crisis. You have these empty luxury hotels everywhere. There's an obvious point about turning that over into, quality housing for Cubans who are, living in desperate situations. But my point is more, it's kind of the only way to start rebuilding the economy. We recognize it's not easy. There's going to be huge privation. It should be equal privations, not the situation right now where there's vast disparities on the island, basically between people who have relatives in Miami or are working the black market and corrupt, including elements within the Communist Party regime that are linked to that, who live vastly, vastly better than the majority of Cubans. Make it equal, as equal as you possibly can. No corruption, no speculation. And these situation where, in order to afford food, you've got to go to a private for-profit store where the government stores have nothing in them. It'll still be poor. There'll still be privation. It won't eliminate the U.S. threat at all. But that would rally the Cuban population to see, well, there's a reason why we should defend this revolution. It's providing equality. It's got rid of the corruption. It's fighting for the greatest egalitarianism possible. So that's kind of how I would answer that point.
Yeah. And I think as you're explaining that, what's very, very clear is how the struggle to provide that perspective and kickstart or try and kickstart some of these measures or motivate that these should be done is completely inseparable from the international side of things,
exactly.
Right? So imagine that you have a left opposition in the country, which is, able to have this perspective be openly debated in multiple forums throughout the country or main cities at least. And then you have the same thing being done to put the maximum amount of pressure, in Mexico and Brazil and China. And this sounds impossible. But nothing came easy. The thing is, it is hard, but it's a life and death situation for a revolution here. But I think it's about the perspective, and I think because things seem so difficult, then there is this huge pressure to just go along with, oh well, this government says it's just trying to construct socialism. Well, no, what is your actual starting point? How do you best defend the revolution? So I do appreciate it. I think, I'm sure that many people will listen and say you're just utopian, but there is no other way to.
I think what's utopian is to think the current policies of the Cuban Communist Party leadership can save the revolution. That's utopian, or utterly false, to use a different word. And I'm not saying this path that we're arguing for here is easy or there's any guarantee of victory. But under current circumstances, I strongly believe it's the only way forward to have a chance of defending the revolution, extending it, and as you quite rightly said, providing a model that can rally working people internationally in a leftist direction away from the right-wing tide that's sweeping the world. And it's not impossible. Cuba, the generation I grew up in quite a while ago, Cuba was a really popular rallying point for people seeking to struggle against imperialism. Fortunately, that's qualitatively less so now, in large part because of the policies of the leadership over time. It could be a rallying point internationally, but requires a thoroughly different course from what's being offered.
Yeah, I think it was. Now we haven't done, the perspective you just laid out. We've yet to write about this, but I think even just hearing about it's powerful in terms of just seeing like there is an alternative.
Yes.
And I think that's. I started the discussion by saying one of the tasks of revolutionaries is to try and chart a concrete road forward for how best to defend the revolution. And that has to be a thoroughly internationalist strategy, which does take up, which is very, very hard against the betrayals of the government right now. I think it's a total crime that much of the left, and, I don't know, this is all online debates I've been having, but, it's a lot of like, the refractions are very much along like the Stalinist versus Trotskyist lines.
Arid debates full of slanders on the parts of the Stalinists. I'm very familiar with that. Yeah, I think that's true. Again, look, we're not on the island. We're saying this from afar, although we do our tendency try to follow as closely as we can developments in Cuba. We've even begun.
Not to mention, we went there with the flotilla.
There. I've personally been there many times. We've had other comrades go there, including very recently as part of the Nuestra America flotilla that we described on the earlier podcast. And we've even begun a series of Spanish language podcasts regularly, roughly weekly, which hopefully you can put the link in the show notes too, to hopefully reach out to elements looking for a way forward in Cuba and more broadly on the left in Latin America, because we think this is absolutely crucial. This is if you like, a world historic situation, maybe not on the level of what happened in the Soviet Union in the late 1980s, early 1990s with the disastrous counterrevolution, but it's of the same ilk. If the Cuban Revolution goes down, especially if it goes down without a fight, thanks to the betrayals of the leadership, this would have a disastrous impact, especially in Latin America, but more broadly internationally. And just to underline again, of course it's not easy, and what I've laid out in terms of the way forward, there's still a level of abstraction to it, and hopefully those on the island or not, who are more intimately familiar with the lay of the land, so to speak, could help flesh that out and maybe even make some constructive correctives to it. But I think that's really the direction of motion we need to go. I guess if I could make... Sorry, go ahead.
Go on.
I was going to say one more point maybe to elaborate when we're talking about a left opposition. That's the key thing we're calling for, a rallying of forces against the current course of the party leadership. So we're appealing for this, not just to leftists abroad, but in Cuba, including dissident supporters within the party and its youth group, the UJC, as well as independent critical leftists on the island and others, to come together on a fighting socialist perspective. The PCC, the party leadership in Cuba, the details of what's going on are very opaque. They talk about socialism, they chant slogans about, long live Fidel, long live Raul, but it's pretty empty. And I think most people now realize the rhetoric's pretty empty. Right now, there's no clear public fractures within the party. But it's also, I think, clear there's widespread unease and discontent, including among those who want to defend the revolution. And this must certainly extend within the party, which has, hundreds of thousands of members. Sometimes I think you have to read between the lines of their various pronouncements. So I thought there was an editorial in Juventud Rebelde, which is the newspaper of the youth group of the party, on the weekend that I thought was telling. This was an article written to justify the PCC's reforms as the only way to defend socialism, etc. But let me just quote what caught my eye. The writer said, "There's also, quote, an avalanche of opinions of all kinds navigating throughout the networks on every corner, in every home or in the neighborhood. I took that as a statement. There's a lot of discontent that
Of course.
that the party has to deal with. I've also seen social media postings by some Cuban academics wondering openly, is there another road? One of the more interesting ones I read was it talked about maybe we should have workers' control of the factories and production rather than handing everything over to the private sector. And even the unanimous vote in the National Assembly to approve the measures, it only came after a statement by Raul Castro, who was 95 years old, and he, I guess, participated remotely in the meeting. He issued a statement supporting the reforms, and he probably has one of the very few surviving veterans of the revolution, and therefore has a lot more moral authority than the current generation of Cuban leaders. And I read that as a kind of calculated move to ensure that even in this National Assembly of delegates, to ensure that any dissidents or even those with doubts would fall into line and vote yes. So I think while things right now look, there's no visible left opposition on the island, I think that's superficial. I think time will tell fairly quickly. And I think one way or the other, in the next period, you're going to see a fracturing in the Cuban Communist Party, including a more openly right-wing faction that's probably ready to embrace more openly U.S. imperialism. There'll also be recalcitrant elements who may not like what's going on, but just get paralyzed and get despaired. But a left opposition could be forged. There's an objective basis for this and a hard necessity, and it's urgent.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And just to pick up on your point about you were motivating our Spanish language podcast earlier. I will definitely link that in the show notes. The whole reason we began that was to try and make an intervention and intersect, Spanish-speaking communists and leftists on the specific question. The whole podcast is dedicated to fighting to defend the Cuban Revolution. So I think with our discussion here, I don't know how far this will travel, but of course we'll try and get it out as much as possible. But there's tons of people in the diaspora from Latin America who speak the language, who may have connections. I think anybody who listens to this who knows Spanish-speaking leftists, get this into their hands and try and propagate these views. What are we talking about here? It's really, you need a left opposition, which is starting point is to oppose these reforms as the only basis to defend the Cuban Revolution. And, for that, you need revolutionary internationalism to really make an appeal to the masses of the world, especially China, to come to Cuba's aid, as well as domestically to start motivating some of the measures that you spoke about, is crucially, the fullest workers' democracy, to debate the fate of the Cuban Revolution. I think that is the road that we're proposing, and I think it's important that we all communists, whatever your shade, if you want to fight for the Cuban Revolution, it's our duty right now to really have this debate out, propagate the different views, to have those exchange of views, to try and build the basis for a left opposition, because the Cuban Revolution hangs in the balance.
Exactly.
All right. Well, on that sober note, I do appreciate you laying all of that out. Certainly the historical examples as well. I think in a period like this, there's just so much going on. There's so much instability. There's so much crazy, scary stuff as well, that it's easy to get tunnel visioned, to succumb to impressionism. So I appreciate the historical broadening out of looking to the Russian Revolution, the counter-revolution in Soviet Union, East Germany, etc. So I think those are definitely lots of things to think about. And again, to our listeners, please do get in touch with your views, your comments, and do share this podcast around with anybody you know who would be interested. So anyways, on that note, thank you very much, John. I appreciate your time.
Thanks, Mansa. Talk again.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Bye.
profiting massive profits, holding us down in lockstep, and your vote, it ain't gonna stop them.